Nietzsche begins his book, Twilight of Idols, with the following maxim, quote, "Idleness is the parent of all psychology. What, is psychology then a vice?" End quote. Is psychology a vice? Meaning that if idle hands are the devil's playground, is psychology one of those vicious temptations that presents itself to us in our moments of leisure time? The Germans have their own version of that English proverb about idle hands, although they put it with more straightforward German bluntness. Their saying is that idleness is the beginning of all vices. And so it is worth asking, is it only in the state of idleness that one begins to inquire about the motivations of the people around them, about the inner drives which gave rise to such characters as they see around them, about their hidden pathologies, their secret desires? Is it that we can only afford to ask such questions when we have the leisure time to inquire after what might have been seen in past ages as useless knowledge? Or is it that the struggle for survival, which is the main pitch at which so many lives are lived, maybe even especially the modern life of the laborer or the businessman, this state of struggle creates a situation where stopping to consider the perspective, the driving desires behind the actions of your competitors, it's simply not an activity that you can see any value in, because understanding one's adversaries is a kind of luxury. It's not afforded to the person whose only existence is struggle. Understanding why your adversary wants to, compete with you or combat with you is not as important as defeating them in that competition or that combat. And understanding them might only be useful to the extent that it helps you do that. And so Nietzsche's thesis might be that true psychological insight that we seek not for any such utilitarian or instrumental means, true psychological insight is not a labor. It's a temptation of the idle mind. And perhaps all inquisitiveness, all curiosity can be understood in this way. And as such, there's an inherently immoral element to it. It leads us to inquire about the motivations behind even our own moral views. Psychology directs our attention in a way that may even be disturbing. It may even be self-undermining. It may be unhealthy. But as we all know, Nietzsche once wrote, perhaps the strength of a soul could be measured in terms of how much truth it could tolerate. That there may be some people with an aptitude to think psychologically, or to speak in Nietzsche's terms, and thus to speak more precisely about it from the Nietzschean standpoint. There might be some with a kind of toughness needed to expose themselves to vice and immorality, the vice of psychology, to expose yourself to that without being, as Nietzsche might put it, sickened by it. Now, so these are the many meanings of calling psychology a vice, and this conception of psychology is central to the book, The Twilight of Idols. Its original title, in fact, was A Psychologist's Idleness, or it could be rendered The Idle Hours of a Psychologist. But Heinrich Koselleck, also known as Peter Gast, entreated upon Nietzsche to change that title. Gast was a sort of disciple of Nietzsche's. He helped Nietzsche in copying and assembling his manuscripts, and this was necessary at the time as Nietzsche's eyesight had worsened, his physiological condition had progressed further. And it's not as if Gast didn't have anything better to do with his time, by the way. Gast was a composer, and he even complained that this magnetic pull that he felt towards Nietzsche's personality had led him to more or less sacrifice his own creative productivity in the service of fostering Nietzsche's work. But nevertheless, he was a sort of editor for Nietzsche, or at least another set of eyes, a set of eyes that weren't currently failing. And so Gast did what many people in the position of editor do, and he urged Nietzsche to make the title a bit more provocative, That's an eternal problem with creatives of all stripes. They never want to name their work according to the principles of marketing. They want to give their work a name which is clever or which encapsulates the artistic meaning behind it. Gast wrote to Nietzsche, quote, "The title, A Psychologist's Idleness, sounds too unassuming to me when I think how it might impress other people. You have driven your artillery on the highest mountains. You have such guns as have never yet existed, and you need only shoot blindly to inspire terror all around. The stride of a giant which makes the mountains shake to their foundations is no longer idleness. So I beg you, if an incompetent person may beg, a more sumptuous, more resplendent title." End quote. The title Nietzsche chose was Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Idols, and that's a play, as is widely known, on Wagner's Götterdämmerung, or Twilight of the Gods. And that certainly, in my opinion, satisfies the need for a title that's a bit more dramatic. But that being said, in comparison to the other four works that Nietzsche managed to write in 1888, his last productive year, I mean, we can just go down the list. His two books on Wagner, the megalomaniacal Ecce Homo, and the most provocative of all of his books, The Antichrist. Well, as Kaufman puts it, quote, "Compared to such fireworks, Twilight of the Idols is relatively calm and sane," end quote. And I would largely agree with Kaufman in that assessment. Twilight of Idols is not the kind of targeted polemic that we get in case of Wagner. It's not the deeply personal Ecce Homo. It's not the crusade that we see in The Antichrist. This is Nietzsche at his most sober and his most dispassionate. It's a kind of calm in between philosophical storms, those maelstroms that mostly characterize 1888 for Nietzsche. Twilight of the Idols is very different from those works. And in fact, it's one of the only books from that period to be published in Nietzsche's lifetime, and relatively quickly. Its publication date of January 1889 was admittedly still too late for Nietzsche to have actually appreciated seeing the work in print, because by that time, he'd already lost his mind and more or less lost his awareness of the external world in any meaningful sense. And so it's another aspect that makes Twilight of Idols a kind of strange book. It's the first major work that Nietzsche writes, publishes, he fires it off in less than a year, and he's insane before it reaches an audience. It's often said that Twilight of Idols is a compilation of Nietzsche's major ideas, but I would say that more important than this, as a comprehensive overview of all of Nietzsche's ideas, I think would be impossible in a book of around 100 pages. More importantly, it speaks to Nietzsche's method. When he writes in the preface of Philosophizing with a Hammer, he reveals to us that he has slipped something beneath this much more aggressive-sounding metaphor, that he is striking idols as with a tuning fork. It's still that same initial idea. Nietzsche's contribution to philosophy is psychological. His method is to sound out the body from which an idea arises, to discover what is driving the person who articulates an ideal. As Deleuze would have it, it is to ask the question, who is speaking here? Nietzsche includes a nod to the original title in his preface to Twilight of Idols when he characterizes the work by saying that, quote, "This essay is above all a recreation, a spot of sunshine, a leap sideways into the idleness of a psychologist." End quote. And although in the concluding remarks of the preface, Nietzsche returns to the imagery of war and declarations of war, perhaps to keep up the militaristic-sounding tone that Gast suggested to him, I can't help but think that this work is much better described in exactly those terms, as a bit of recreation. The tenor of strife and struggle may actually be contrary to the spirit of this book. That here Nietzsche's mood is elevated, his vantage point is the man looking down from a height, and when he lets loose an arrow, it's from a great distance, more to test his aim or as a bit of fun, rather than aiming artillery guns in order to shoot at an enemy. And so we're going to consider what Nietzsche says about psychology here in the book formerly called The Idle Hours of a Psychologist. Treating psychology as the philosophical method of Nietzsche, psychology considered in the broadest possible sense. In the previous episode, we examined at length some of the psychological errors that Nietzsche wished to sound out over the course of this work, but today we're interested in Nietzsche's understanding of what he is doing when he thinks psychologically about philosophical ideas. His own understanding of his method, which he attempts to impart to us over the course of this book. The first such passage I wanted to consider, in fact, serves to complicate the picture I've given here at the introduction. This is section 15 of the chapter Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, which serves as a kind of critique of psychological thinking. That is, of course, classic Nietzsche. He can't engage in a mode of thought without also critiquing it. But we might even say that this is the tradition of philosophers since the time of Kant. As, a figure who has such a reputation for trying to salvage human reason, but he does this through a critique of reason. So, this particular section in Nietzsche is entitled Casuistry of Psychologists. Remember the origin of the term casuistry. This came up when we discussed Pascal and the fact that he was part of a Catholic sect that opposed the Jesuits, who argued by means of casuistry. Casuistry in its original meaning is the application of the rules according to specific circumstances. In other words, to tailor one's theoretical or moral principles according to the situation. Over time, however, the term casuistry, as it became associated with the perceived ends justify the means type thinking of the Jesuits, it comes to be synonymous with sophistry or self-serving logic. It acquires that connotation. And so the best I could do at straightforwardly explaining the casuistrist state of mind is that, you might say, well, sure, certainly this is the universal rule. But in this case, we may have to modify that rule to fit our specific circumstances. And then the negative connotation that this acquires is that over time, the way that you modify those circumstances will always be, or the way that you modify the rule to fit your circumstances will always be self-serving. The way that one decides when and where the rules ought to be modified based on the situation, how will they make that decision? And I don't think you need an immoralist like Nietzsche to make the accusation, as the church would also have made it, that human beings will often modify the rules according to their personal advantage, what gives them advantage. So in this passage, The Casuistry of Psychologists, Nietzsche gives us a picture of two different people with two very different motivations for studying psychology. He writes, quote, "This man knows human nature. Why does he really study people? He wants to seize little advantages over them, or big ones for that matter. He is a politician. That one over there also knows human nature, and yet you say that he seeks no profit for himself, that he is thoroughly impersonal. Look more closely. Perhaps he even wants a worse advantage, to feel superior to other human beings, to be able to look down on them, and no longer to mistake himself for one of them. This impersonal type is a despiser of human beings, while the first type is the more humane species, appearances notwithstanding. At least he places himself on the same plane. He places himself among them." End quote. There's so many things to say about this passage just when considered within the context of this work. First of all, I said it raises a complication to the way I have presented Nietzsche's psychologizing in this work because I've described him as more sober and dispassionate. We might say impersonal. And yet here he says the impersonal type of psychologist is the despiser of human beings, which is not usually the way Nietzsche would favorably describe a thinker. Instead, Nietzsche suggests that the man who wishes to know psychological insights for the purposes of gaining an advantage amongst human beings, such as the politician, is a far more humane kind of person. And as for what Nietzsche means by humane, we might here think of a Cesare Borgia or a Napoleon, one of those great politicians that Nietzsche tended to have a positive appraisal of. This is the kind of person who doesn't seek after useless knowledge or knowledge of mankind as part of a mere idle pursuit, but seeks it because, in so many words, such insights will aid them in their quest for power. And therefore, perhaps paradoxically, this kind of honest, sober understanding of themselves as a power-driven organism is more humanist, for lack of a better word. It's not placing themselves above the power struggle that characterizes life. It is a part of their means of carrying out that struggle with the full understanding that they are a part of it, that they are a human among humans, a power-driven, power-seeking, power-expressing creature. And what Nietzsche says about the impersonal type of psychologist is quite in line with his earlier writings on selfishness and the selfish origin of all apparently selfless virtues. That there's no truly impersonal, disinterested search for knowledge. That the will to truth is itself an expression of the will to power. And thus that the impersonal psychologist is also expressing a will to power through his quest for knowledge about human beings. And that he is in fact doing so for a reason that serves that end, which may indicate that he seeks a far worse form of advantage over others than any Cesare Borgia or Napoleon. All the way back in Nietzsche's 1875 fragment, Science and Wisdom in Battle, he argues that the acquisition of scientific knowledge attracted people to it beyond the mere material advantage that it gives, because such knowledge allows one to feel that they can in some sense stand above the endless quarrels and ignorant opinions of the many. Philosophy can, as Montaigne says, draw the mind out of the body for a little while. Let one's intellect play in a realm of thought and abstraction, which is above this base world of power struggles, for and against, yes and no, petty concerns and petty quarrels and so on and so forth. And so now the question we might have after reading this passage might be the following. Is Nietzsche more like the politician, the man with the personal interest in psychology? Or is he more like the impersonal psychologist, who wishes to set himself above the crowd? I think the answer is that Nietzsche is, for better or for worse, the impersonal type. But he is an impersonal type who is self-aware enough to know that his supposedly impersonal psychologizing is actually deeply personal. That it is his own way of exercising his will to power and putting himself above other human beings. And that if we look to the things Zarathustra says about mankind, he has a great contempt for the state of mankind as it is now. And the reason for this is largely because of the inner pathologies that he uncovers about mankind. And that even though Nietzsche might have harsh words for someone who despises human beings out of a moral condemnation for them, for which, they might say the only solution is the holy life, the ascetic life. Perhaps Nietzsche's philosophical project represents a self-aware attempt to turn that sense of disgust or contempt for the state of mankind into something positive, a call for mankind to overcome itself here in physical reality, rather than, for example, to wish for deliverance in another life. And Nietzsche, in some sense, has to do this. From on the height, he has to do this in order to make such a claim or craft such a valuation, to be such a legislator of morality. He has to place himself above mankind. And in some sense, can't make those claims. If he's doing it for the good of the whole species of humankind, he can't make these claims as instrumental towards some political or personal end in the petty sense. But the implications of this passage are just so fascinating to consider because of the very fact that Nietzsche is, by this token, somewhat paradoxically placing himself back within the realm of human beings. By being the, quote, impersonal psychologist, who in turn recognizes that his interest is not impersonal, that no interest is impersonal. It's in some sense a contradiction in terms. Nietzsche is becoming more humane by that same token. He is, to use his own words, placing himself back on that same plane, placing himself among humanity. He's driven by the same thing that all the rest of humanity is driven by. This powerful self-awareness is perhaps the thing that Nietzsche's successors in psychoanalysis most lauded Nietzsche for and saw as most valuable in his work. Of course, there's that famous quotation from Freud that Nietzsche possessed the greatest self-awareness of perhaps any man who's ever lived. But is this an advantage to the psychologist? In one of Nietzsche's aphorisms contained in the first section, Maxims and Arrows, Nietzsche suggests that, in fact, it isn't. He writes in 35, quote, "There are cases in which we are like horses, we psychologists, and become restless. We see our own shadow wavering up and down before us. A psychologist must turn his eyes from himself to eye anything at all." End quote. Okay, so the metaphor he uses there, the psychologist may at times be like a horse spooked by seeing his own shadow. You might recall a number of other passages from other works on the same theme, most notably the preface to the Genealogy, which opens with Nietzsche's declaration, "We men of knowledge are strangers to ourselves." That there is a sense in which the object of one's study may be too close for you to see it clearly in some cases. That in the case of ourselves and our own motivations, we may actually be, paradoxically, farther away from our own wisdom or insight than any of the other subjects of our inquiries, even though the self is supposedly closer to us than anything else. That perhaps we could say the self, the ego, the persona, that's the one thing we're truly incapable of being impersonal about. And so how can we achieve any degree of objectivity in a project of what we might call auto-psychoanalysis? Uncovering a disturbing pathology that drives the actions of someone else may be, that's an interesting factoid, right? One could write an interesting psychoanalytic study about it and publish it in a journal. But would we count on the same psychoanalyst being comfortable in uncovering his own disturbing pathology and publishing an article about it in a journal? We might again think of Freud, who has often been accused of universalizing many of his own pathologies into universal pathologies, driving all human psychology, such as the Oedipus complex. As a Jungian might say, perhaps it was the very fact that he didn't want to acknowledge the Oedipus complex as his own, as something belonging to Freud, that led him to see it as something which didn't have any special purchase on his own psyche. It was simply definitive of all human psychology. And yet when we look at the anecdotes of Freud, and especially when we look at the things he had to say about his relationship to his father, we can see why a man like Freud would have come down with a bad case of the Oedipus complex. But this isn't an argument against self-knowledge. If anything, it's a cautionary tale in favor of it. And so once again, we have to wonder what it is Nietzsche is actually doing in this maxim, when he says that we have to turn our eyes away from ourselves in order to see anything at all. It is interesting that Nietzsche uses the language immediately before that of seeing one's own shadow. Keep in mind, Nietzsche doesn't use the shadow in the Jungian sense. He uses the shadow in his own work as a metaphor for one's self-image, the persona, the ego consciousness. It's a sort of two-dimensional shade that is a mere silhouette of that vast subterranean panoply of forces that actually characterizes the human being, right? So what we really are is the body, the unconscious drives and impulses which exist in these sorts of relationships of tension. And it, by definition, as it is unconscious, the majority of the operations are unknown to us. The great activity is unconscious, and abstract, rational, discursive, conscious thought creates a narration of what is happening, and that sort of silhouette, that self-image, that's more like a shadow cast by our conscious being. Well, Nietzsche was certainly a man who, quote, saw his own shadow and was spooked by it. He writes an entire book called The Wanderer and His Shadow, which is framed within a dialogue between the wanderer, the sort of precursor figure to Zarathustra, talking to his own shadow. Nietzsche himself certainly turned his eye to his own persona, inspected his own mask, we might say, and he inquired as to what it meant. So, does he himself follow the advice that he gives in this maxim? I suppose if I were to attempt to square the circle here, remember what Nietzsche calls the congenital defect of philosophers, to take one's own prejudices, one's own values, one's own presuppositions about reality and pose them as something eternal, and on that basis to come to erroneous conclusions about values as such or about humanity as such. What Nietzsche is pointing to here is the necessity to understand ourselves through our knowledge of the world, rather than the starting tendency of most philosophers, psychologists, thinkers, whatever, to try and understand the world through knowledge of ourselves. In some sense, you could say that's the continental tradition going back to Descartes. Let me look deep within myself. What do my deepest intuitions tell me about the nature of reality? Nietzsche says, in other words, to turn our eyes outward, let the book of the world, our study of nature, our study of people from all ages and cultures, who don't have the same valuations and presuppositions as we do, let that inform our knowledge of ourselves. So it's not, again, that's my way of squaring the circle of saying it's ultimately not against self-knowledge, which is something that Nietzsche is also known for. It's inverting the way that we seek knowledge of the self. And that's the only antidote you could argue against projection. It's a way of safeguarding yourself, of keeping yourself from seeing as universal what is only in your own shadow. Again, shadow used in the Nietzschean sense rather than the Jungian sense. Although you could argue there's applications in both ways, both systems of thinking here. But just when we think we're getting a handle on it, there's a caveat to this as well. It actually comes a little earlier in the text. I'm kind of assembling this in a narrative fashion that I think best conveys the total picture of Nietzsche's psychological approach. But we're going to go look at section 7 of Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, entitled A Moral for Psychologists. Quote, "Do not go in for any notebook psychology. Never observe for the sake of observing. Such things lead to a false point of view, to a squint, to something forced and exaggerated. To experience things on purpose. This is not a bit of good. In the midst of an experience, a man should not turn his eyes upon himself. In such cases, any eye becomes the evil eye. A born psychologist instinctively avoids seeing for the sake of seeing, and the same holds good of the born painter. Such a man never works from nature. He leaves it to his instinct, to his camera obscura, to sift and to define the fact, nature, the experience. The general idea, the conclusion, the result is the only thing that reaches his consciousness. He knows nothing of that willful process of deducing from particular cases. What is the result when a man sets about this matter differently? When, for instance, after the manner of Parisian novelists, he goes in for notebook psychology on a large and small scale. Such a man is constantly spying on reality, and every evening he bears home a handful of fresh curios. But look at the result, a mass of splotches, at best a piece of mosaic, in any case something heaped together, restless and garish. The Goncourts are the greatest sinners in this respect. They cannot put 3 sentences together which are not absolutely painful to the eye of the psychologist. From an artistic standpoint, nature is no model. It exaggerates, distorts, and leaves gaps. Nature is chance. To study from nature seems to me a bad sign. It betrays submission, weakness, fatalism. This lying in the dust before trivial facts is unworthy of a thorough artist. To see what is the function of another order of spirit, the anti-artistic, the matter of fact. One must know who one is." End quote. So these remarks, Nietzsche begins on a note very similar to the one sounded by Goethe in Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe. In Goethe's case, about poets rather than psychologists, the underlying principle that he tries to argue is the same. The poet ought to write what Goethe calls occasional poems, meaning that one writes poetry according to the experiences that you are given in the natural course of life. That's in contrast to the contrived projects involved in a great work, such as Eckermann's proposal of, writing a poem about the 4 seasons, in which he would compose verses about all the different people of different occupations and the rhythms of their lives at each point in the year. Goethe says this is a bad idea, because one might write a brilliant poem about spring, but a subpar poem about summer, but now the 2 pieces are tied together. And besides, you would have to go out and gather up all sorts of experience about ways of life which are not your own. You have to artificially construct a web of many different experiences and seek out such experiences to base the poem upon rather than the occasional poem, when one simply writes what happened to actually occur in their experience on a given occasion, what was given to them by the chance moments of the day. And that sort of is the same sentiment that Nietzsche applies to the Psychologists. He echoes at the end of this passage where he says, nature is chance, and chance is emphasized in the passage. In Nietzsche's language here, the analogy to psychology is straightforward. Notebook psychology is the type of psychology that is contrived in the same manner. Notebook psychology is practiced by someone who goes out looking for psychological insights, trying, or we might say laboring in order to distill some psychological truth out of those around them, trying to squeeze it out of them with great effort. They become the type of person who spies on reality. Everything about this is the opposite of psychology done out of leisure. Nietzsche's criticism of this belabored approach is actually not too far from Goethe's sentiments, since he talks about it in the language of art, in this case, literary prose. The implication would be that in literary fiction, this is where the great wealth of psychological insight is. In the novel, one creates characters. The chief driver of the story is the motivations and the desires of those characters, and the way that those desires contrast or conflict with one another. And so a prerequisite for writing fiction is an understanding of human psychology. Maybe not even a conscious one, but an understanding nonetheless. So the novels of the Goncourts, two brothers who wrote all of their books as collaborations, Nietzsche criticizes them in this passage in terms of stylistic excesses. The words are painful to read together. Encyclopedia Britannica says of the Goncourts that, quote, their novels are hardly stories at all, but picture galleries, hung with pictures of the momentary aspects of the world, end quote. And so in Nietzsche's view, the Goncourts based their characters on notebook psychology, which makes the characters a mishmash of forcibly extracted character traits that are then cobbled together. This isn't what real people are like, and you shouldn't approach the study of a human being that way, supposing that such a study were based purely on what is given, right, in the natural course of one's experience. The born psychologist doesn't have to go looking for psychological insights. He finds them without looking for them, simply by observing carefully out of a natural propensity for observing whatever he comes into contact with. And this may seem like a merely aesthetic point, but that key distinction here, leisure versus labor. The born psychologist is the term Nietzsche uses, person for whom these insights come naturally. It's like fruit just falling off the tree. There's no directed, concerted effort. The tension throughout the passage is between a forced, willful approach in which one squints, one exaggerates, one becomes restless, but true psychology happens when one is at rest. The one who simply sees because it's right in front of his eyes. He doesn't have to force himself to receive what is given. He doesn't have to squint to find the pathology or what have you. And again, there's a question at the end when Nietzsche says that to see what is necessarily an anti-artistic mode of approach to life. Groveling before every trivial fact is unbecoming of the artist. One must know who he is rather than what is. The distinction Nietzsche is making here might seem obscure until we consider it in the light of his analysis of the pre-Platonic philosophers. The fact that they were first and foremost a series of men with singular personalities who philosophized by recasting the world in their own image. And he calls this an artistic way of doing philosophy, in that in his lectures on them. He contrasts their kind of metaphysical leaping, what we might call the poetic license of the philosopher. Whatever it is in the philosopher that allows him to dare to make claims about the unity of all reality. Whatever that factor is, whether we call it daring, bravery, or Nietzsche might refer to it as creativity. That creative way of philosophizing is contrasted with the philosophizing of Socrates and his student Plato. One is described as leaping, the other as planning out and constructing a bridge in order to make their way across. The Socratic approach to philosophy is anti-artistic. It's the kind of theoretical approach to life, which is of the kind of the mindset that wants to stop and inspect every last trivial fact. And it concerns itself fundamentally with the question of what is. So it seems that here Nietzsche is raising that dichotomy of approaches. The theoretical approach to life will not even give us the psychological truth. That the anti-artistic, Socratic way of approaching human beings will yield only a hodgepodge of isolated insights, and we won't even feel comfortable universalizing based on them or making terribly strong claims about those insights, because in order to do that, it requires some of that irrational creativity. And this is why the theoretician, the pure theoretician, is not a psychologist. His insights have to get smaller and smaller and more particularized and more specific and more trivial. So in spite of all of his commitment to objectivity, the one thing that might be of greatest value is the one thing that he can never give us, which is an objective picture of the unity of the external world, we might say. And this is why Nietzsche would characterize Socratism, the philosophy of Socrates, the theoretical approach to life, when taken to a totality, to be ultimately superficial. It catalogs a number of surface-level, observable traits that can be empirically gathered and documented. The anti-artistic nature of this approach denies the irrational, and it therefore denies what is a very real artistic tendency in human thought. And so it gives us incomplete rendering of the human being, or it renders an incomplete image of the human being. And so we've brought the conversation concerning psychology into dialogue with aesthetics, with Nietzsche comparing the psychologist to both the novelist and the painter. It may be worth looking at the very next section then in Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, which is number 8, entitled Concerning the Psychology of the Artist. Nietzsche writes, quote, "For art to be possible at all, that is to say, in order that an aesthetic mode of action and of observation may exist, a certain preliminary physiological state is indispensable ecstasy. This state of ecstasy must first have intensified the susceptibility of the whole machine, otherwise no art is possible. All kinds of ecstasy, however differently produced, have this power to create art, and above all, the state dependent upon sexual excitement, this most venerable and primitive form of ecstasy. The same applies to that ecstasy which is the outcome of all great desires, all strong passions, the ecstasy of the feast, of the arena, of the act of bravery, of victory, of all extreme action, the ecstasy of cruelty, the ecstasy of destruction, the ecstasy following upon certain meteorological influences, as for instance that of springtime, or upon the use of narcotics. And finally, the ecstasy of will, that ecstasy which recruits from accumulated and surging willpower. The essential feature of ecstasy is the feeling of increased strength and abundance. Actuated by this feeling, a man gives of himself two things. He forces them to partake of his riches. He does violence to them. This proceeding is called idealizing. Let us rid ourselves of a prejudice here. Idealizing does not consist, as is generally believed, in a suppression or an elimination of detail, or of unessential features. A stupendous accentuation of the principal characteristics is by far the most decisive factor at work, and in consequence, the minor characteristics vanish." End quote. So, comparing the theoretical approach to life to the artistic, the minor characteristics vanish in the artistic, whereas in the theoretical, they come straight into the forefront of our attention. So Nietzsche often seems to speak on behalf of the artistic, and in fact his critique of notebook psychology seems to be, in essence, a critique of its anti-artistic character. And yet, he here associates art with idealizing, which is not presented in a negative light in this passage, which is another strange aspect. Remember, this is the same year he writes Ecce Homo, where he says, I don't refute ideals, I merely put on my gloves before them. We might think of a medical professional putting on gloves before inspecting a diseased patient. He describes ideals in that work, well, fundamentally as something sick or sickly. They always express a deep need, a deep lack on behalf of the person who creates the ideal. And yet again, in his Psychology of the Artist, he describes the artist as somebody who first and foremost is driven by feelings of ecstasy. Kaufman actually renders it differently. He translates it as frenzy, but I think ecstasy has a more explanatory connotation in this context. The artist experiences ecstasy in some aspect of life, and he overflows with this feeling into an artistic representation, the desire to share his riches, to force others to partake of them. It's what Nietzsche calls a stupendous accentuation of a given characteristic or feeling or mood, and this is the idealization of the artist. A lot of this is, I talk about this extensively in my book, which, as of when this episode airs, has just come out. So I'm not just trying to plug my book here, but I've written a whole, sort of inquiry on that very topic. But to return to Nietzsche, we should evaluate this psychological portrait of the artist that he gives. Let's evaluate it impersonally, without making such judgments or evaluations. Let's first ask, is Nietzsche's characterization of the artist's psychology accurate? I think that largely it is, although I might put it into slightly different language, but language which I think accords with the spirit of Nietzsche's point here. Any feeling which the artist may have, which momentarily absorbs the sum total of their being, to put it in poetic terms, whatever captures the whole of their attention, whether the feeling is positive or negative, whether the experience is ecstatic or tragic, anything that sufficiently captures the whole of the artist's attention can become a sort of numinous experience to the artist, which they then attempt to share through their artwork. The feeling is associated with or represented by the artist's play upon the senses. So the artist tries to communicate something or achieve a kind of sentimental communication with the audience, because they're communicating a sentiment, right? Through representing somehow a feeling in the language of sights, sounds, sensation, broadly. Now, in the process of this, some characteristic of reality, some aspect of reality is accentuated. And the reason for this is that art tends to condense our attention, to compress our focus into one aspect. And that's required in order to achieve that sharing of the artist's feeling. He has to entirely take you within the world of that feeling. And so this doesn't therefore represent what we might call an objective representation of reality, but rather an idealization, a distortion of reality, a condensation of reality, a folding of reality. Nietzsche talks about ideals in this context, much in the same way that he talks about ideals in Ecce Homo, and that the artist's idealization, just as the aesthetics, are both falsifications of reality. Ideal has the same meaning here in that sense. The artist is not expressing what is. But it would be a mistake to suggest that Nietzsche is therefore against the aesthetic, that he puts on his gloves before art the way that he does before the religious idols of mankind. And why is that? Well, because the artist, the true artist, creates out of that inner abundance. Art is an expression of their power. It's the inner sense of worth and creative power that leads one to think that they can create their own vision of the world. And so we might say that the ascetics idealization, the saint's idealization, produces ideals of weakness, ideals out of want, out of lack, out of deficit, whereas the artist's type of idealization produces an ideal of strength, or ideals out of abundance, ecstasy, the desire to share out of an overflowing abundance. Nietzsche continues his psychological inquiry into art in section 24, entitled L'art pour l'art, art for the sake of art, art for art's sake. It's a common refrain of artists, precisely because they are not the kind of people who seriously inquire after what is. They are not impersonal observers by any stretch. And so they're rather naive about what art actually is and what actually fires the process of art. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "A psychologist puts the question, what does all art do? Does it not praise? Does it not glorify? Does it not select? Does it not bring things into prominence? In all this, it strengthens or weakens certain valuations. Is this only a secondary matter, an accident, something in which the artist's instinct has no share? Or is it not rather the very prerequisite which enables the artist to accomplish something? Is his most fundamental instinct concerned with art? Is it not rather concerned with the purpose of art, with life, with a certain desirable kind of life? Art is the great stimulus to life. How can it be regarded as purposeless, as pointless, as l'art pour l'art?" End quote. And I just want to note, there's not a single period in that entire paragraph. It's all question marks. So Nietzsche's just asking questions. Okay, so to praise, to glorify, to strengthen, or weaken certain valuations. In other words, to make war upon the real with one's ideal. Is this a mere accident of the creation of art? Or is it actually its purpose? And Nietzsche's implication here is that to regard anything that is as of much importance to humanity as art is, as being somehow purposeless or pointless, that's sort of a willfully ignorant position. That art for art's sake is not a plausible explanation for art, and that it is far more likely that it exists for the very purpose of idealizing some impulse, some experience, some sentiment within the artist. And that in some way, this task serves life. To take a step back and consider the lens through which we're now viewing the Twilight of the Idols, what is significant is not so much these comments about the specific case of the artist, but again, Nietzsche's psychological method to recognize immediately that the phrase l'art pour l'art is itself the voice of an impulse or a tendency in thought. And what could that be? Well, it's a tendency to think that art is entirely pointless, that is to say, of no consequence. Why would one say such a thing? Well, Nietzsche says that the actual sentiment might be translated as, let morality go to the devil. That is to say, if we have given up the Christian viewpoint that art is meant to elevate and to nourish the soul, or the Christian view that art is there to turn our thoughts or our focus toward the divine. If you look back at what they had to say about why they created such beautiful cathedrals in Catholic Christendom, that is why. And that's another way of saying that art is meant to save and morally instruct us. But if we've given up that notion, does art have any point at all? And the kind of person who will take up for the notion that art has no point at all is that, so they're speaking from some sort of impulse that is to the advantage of that impulse to think that. And so one type of person might be the kind of person who wants to unchain art from any sense of power or responsibility. To unbound the creation of art from any purpose is to justify any use for it. Or rather, we might say, if art has no invalid or valid uses, if it's all just a matter of subjectivity, how could art be misused? Doesn't that become a meaningless statement? So what happens is the psychologist, the born psychologist, when he encounters a phenomenon for which we already have an easy explanation, he doesn't just accept it, but he inquires after both the origin and the driving impulse of the phenomenon itself, and the origin and driving impulse of the explanation for the phenomenon is also instructive. So when Nietzsche considers Schopenhauer's explanation for art, for example, that the aesthetic experience is a gateway to the negation of the will to live, that art could allow us to lose ourselves in will-less contemplation of the objective, allowing us to part, at least momentarily, with this world of striving and suffering, of desiring and pursuing. When Nietzsche encounters this, he has the following to say as a psychologist, quote, "According to Schopenhauer's doctrine, the general object of art was to free one from the will, and what he honored as the great utility of tragedy was that it made people more resigned. But this, as I have already shown, is a pessimistic standpoint. It is the evil eye. The artist himself must be appealed to. What is it that the soul of the tragic artist communicates to others? Is it not precisely his fearless attitude towards that which is terrible and questionable?" End quote. So in art, Schopenhauer perceives that the underlying value of art, the point of art, happens to be exactly the same as the underlying values of his own philosophical system. Art is aimed at resignationism, that art is essentially pessimistic. Nietzsche's viewpoint couldn't be any more different than Schopenhauer's, since Nietzsche has described art as an overflow of life and power. It expresses a sort of fearless attitude to the terrible experiences of life, the tragic embrace of calamity versus the resignationism of Schopenhauer. But again, so there's that contrast. But more important than simply noticing the contrast is the fact that Nietzsche would attribute the fundamental difference here to the fact that Nietzsche has an understanding of psychology, whereas Schopenhauer is not a psychologist. Schopenhauer, if anything, is a case for the psychologist to study rather than a psychologist himself. Because in almost every single interpretation with Schopenhauer, it's a misinterpretation. In Schopenhauer, everything is his own confession. There's basically nothing in Nietzsche's view that escapes from the weight of Schopenhauer's own ponderous shadow, so to speak. So Nietzsche elaborates on Schopenhauer's psychology in another section of Twilight of the Idols. He writes that his philosophy represented, quote, "a malicious though masterly attempt to enlist on the side of a general nihilistic depreciation of life the very forces which are opposed to such a movement. That is to say, the great self-affirming powers of the will to live, the exuberant forms of life itself." He interpreted art, heroism, genius, beauty, great sympathy, knowledge, the will to truth, and tragedy, one after the other, as the results of the denial, or of the need of the denial, of the will. The greatest forgery, Christianity always accepted, which history has to show. End quote. So the great forgery of Schopenhauer is taking everything vital in mankind and turning it against vitality. In the final analysis, what is driving Schopenhauer? Well, Nietzsche says it's from those same Christian sentiments that Schopenhauer's philosophy emerges. His project is essentially a secular Christianity. It's a secular attempt to enshrine the ascetic ideal over mankind as the highest value. A desire to be delivered from this life, a desire to be delivered from this world, from the passions that one experiences in this embodied world. Schopenhauer interprets all of these human phenomena, all of these human strivings, as valuable only insofar as they gave us a taste of that salvation, or at least stirred us to the desire for a salvation from the world, from the embodied world. And so art and heroism and the search for truth, all of this is valuable insofar as it leads us to wish to be delivered from life. And so it should be raised at this point that there's a way in which the kind of psychology that Nietzsche practices is essentially, you could see it as an exercise in distinguishing who is speaking as a born psychologist and who is practicing false psychology. Because most of the great artists and thinkers throughout all the ages, they all presume to tell us something about mankind, right? As we've said, a novel in some way is an exploration of human psychology, which means that psychology is demonstrably a perennial element in human thought and in human creativity. Every time you say people are this way or that way, human beings are like this, etc., you sort of present yourself as a psychologist. And so we have centuries, millennia of psychological claims about human beings. But which of these claims were made out of a genuine psychological observation, going from an understanding of the world down to the level of the individual psyche, rather than extrapolating the world out of one's own shadow? And how many of these claims were made while operating from a psychology that exists perhaps in the service of one's pathologies? How many of these claims were products of notebook psychology, cobbling together a bunch of superficial character traits, as one strains one's eyes to see the psychological phenomenon that they want to see? This is perhaps a meta level to this task of Nietzsche's. You can't take a philosopher's claim of being a psychologist at face value. You have to sort them, so to speak, into psychologists and cases. Who was actually observing and reporting what came before their eyes, and who was essentially just confessing to us their own pathologies and hallucinations. So in short, Schopenhauer for Nietzsche is a case. He's a case for a first-rate psychologist, but his significance is as a case and not as a psychologist himself. And cases can be incredibly valuable. They might tell us more than the writings of a bad or unobservant psychologist. A really informative case might be enough for a person. You might have one really informative case about mankind, and if you are a natural psychologist with that natural aptitude, you might glean all the secrets of the human mind from just that one case. Many of the chapters of Twilight of Idols read like accounts of such cases. The problem of Socrates might as well have been called the case of Socrates. Nietzsche analyzes Socrates as though he's looking over a patient, diagnosing the cause of all of Socrates' aberrations. How did this mutation spring up somehow in the midst of Greek society? Or we could look to The Four Great Errors, that passage where Nietzsche looks at what he sees to be just a plainly illogical series of premises that nevertheless form the structure of our thinking when it comes to cause and effect. But he directs his focus to why it is that we would adopt such errors from a psychological standpoint. What is the psychological need for thinking in such an erroneous way? Assuming that even if it is erroneous, there must be some reason for why we've held on to it and continued to nurture such habits and thought. Or the passage, How the True World Finally Became a Fable. The history of an error is the subtitle of that passage. So that the history of another error in our thought and the exploration of how that error developed, psychological origin of the error, how it changed over the centuries. The chapter Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, which we've quoted from at length, sees Nietzsche psychologizing, analyzing the likes of Saint Beuve, George Sand, Renan. Renan is a case worth considering with a bit more depth, actually, because he's another figure who presents himself as a psychologist, but Nietzsche would say is actually just another head case. Ernest Renan was born in 1823, and he's therefore a contemporary of Nietzsche's. He's a figure Nietzsche mentions many times in his work, but never as a positive influence. He directs a decent chunk of his polemic in The Antichrist to the work of Renan, particularly his Life of Jesus. In that work, Renan reinterpreted the figure of Jesus in a number of ways that were both antithetical to Nietzsche's understanding and also historically disastrous, although Renan obviously did not know this at the time. Renan interpreted Jesus as a human being rather than divine, and it was a move that infuriated the Christians at that time. He believed that he was honoring Jesus by affirming his humanity, proclaiming him as a heroic figure, but he said of Jesus that he was able to transcend his Judaism and become an Aryan. Just as Jesus takes the teachings of the Jewish Old Testament and uses it to create the new religion of Christianity, Jesus quite literally transforms himself from a Jew into a Christian Aryan. And that bears comparison with the writings of Elizabeth Nietzsche's husband, Bernard Fuster, who wrote that Jesus was an Aryan fighter who emerged against the dark backdrop of the Jewish people so that his heroic light would, shine all the clearer in contrast to them. And so Renan is part of a zeitgeist at the time that was doing a number of things with the image of Jesus that accorded with the trends of thought in contemporary Germany. They were embracing the secularization of religious stories and the attempt to see beneath these stories, into something perhaps more of a universal truth, like the archetype of the hero. And so Renan thought that this biblical character could be treated like any other historical figure, subjected to historical criticism. But again, what's also popular at the time in Germany is anti-Semitism, the desire to separate Christianity from its Jewish origins and reimagine Christianity as a kind of national religious character. The fact that it is linked at the hip with Judaism is always seen as sort of problematic by these Christian anti-Semites in Germany. And the fact that Bernard Fuster's ideas are so similar to Renan's, I think, I'm always very much against blaming people for later actions taken based on their work and influence, but I think we can at least say this indicates the vulgarity and the bad psychology that was driving Renan. As, Foster's part of the movement that eventually gives rise to Nazism. I think Renan can be justifiably seen as just prefiguring much of the erroneous habits and thought that we would later see in Bernard Foster. The fact that in many ways, even as they're trying to secularize Jesus and make the religious more maybe material and empirical, their actual evidence for many of the claims they made don't bear up under empirical analysis. And in some sense, to the modern mind, are kind of somewhat nonsensical even. But anyway, so Nietzsche lambasts Renan in The Antichrist by arguing that Jesus is not a heroic archetype. The hero is the one who fights, but Jesus' approach is to resist not evil. And Nietzsche says that this phrase is a sort of key to the Gospels. It's the true message of the Gospel, that the Gospel teaches its followers not to resist. It shows them the example of a God become man who doesn't resist even his own death and martyrdom. He nonviolently accepts his own sacrifice for the good of mankind. Nietzsche also argues in that book that Judaism and Christianity are in fact not separate. Christianity grows out of Judaism. It's the budding flower of Judaism. Nietzsche writes at one point, Jesus and Paul are essentially Jewish figures. There's no possibility in Nietzsche for setting up this opposition or antagonism between the Christian religion and the Jewish religion. Christianity is the refinement, the universalization of Judaism. Further, in Beyond Good and Evil, there's a passage where Nietzsche mentions Renan as his antithesis, a thinker in a totally antipodal relationship with him. Because Renan writes that the psychologically normal state of the human soul is a religious state of the soul, that man is, quote, most in touch with truth when he is most religious and most assured of an infinite destiny. When he is good, he wants virtue to correspond to an eternal order. When he contemplates things in a disinterested manner, he finds death revolting and absurd. How can we not assume that it is in those former moments that man sees best? End quote. So that's from Beyond Good and Evil. And Nietzsche quotes those words from Renan, says there's no sentiment altogether more foreign to his ears than the one expressed there. He calls these sentences beautiful because they so powerfully bring out the contrast between his thought and that of Renan. But he says that from his perspective, Renan turns truth on her head. And what is Renan doing in such a passage? He's being a false psychologist. He's setting as, quote, normal or healthy the religious condition of the mind. He's affirming the Christian, the Catholic perspective on life as the healthy perspective, the default. And that's why Nietzsche writes that Renan is even too Christian for such northerners as the Germans. Although, again, if we look at figures like Foster and his similarity to Renan, I'm not sure if Nietzsche was right about that. But nevertheless, he argues there's always a lurking religious impulse in Renan, which Nietzsche takes to be indicative of just like the intractably Catholic spirit of the French. It always wishes to unbend any tension within the soul, disrupt any productive relations of tension within one's thought. Renan's mind is always tending toward the release of tension, the Sabbath of Sabbaths. That's what we might say is sort of the fundamentally anti-life sentimentality of the Catholic. So really, Renan should be studied as a case, not as a psychologist. And this is what Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols, Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, Section 2, entitled Renan. Quote, Theology, or the corruption of reason by original sin, Christianity. Proof of this, Renan, who even in those rare cases where he ventures to say either yes or no on a general question, invariably misses the point with painful regularity. For instance, he would fain associate science and nobility, but surely it must be obvious that science is democratic. He seems to be actuated by a strong desire to represent an aristocracy of intellect, but at the same time grovels on his knees, and not only on his knees, before the opposite doctrine, the gospel of the humble. What is the good of all free-spiritedness, modernity, mockery, and acrobatic suppleness if in one's belly one is still a Christian, a Catholic, even a priest? Renan's forte, precisely like that of a Jesuit and father confessor, lies in his seductiveness. His intellectuality is not devoid of that unctuous complacency of a parson. Like all priests, he becomes dangerous only when he loves. He is second to none in the art of skillfully worshipping, a dangerous thing. This intellect of Renan's, which in its action is enervating, is one calamity the more for poor sick France, with her will to power all going to pieces. End quote. So the intellect of Renan is enervating, the opposite of energizing. Renan makes one feel drained of all energy, all activity. And while it might appear that Nietzsche is setting up Renan as a man with opposite poles of spirit, with relations of tension in his soul, say aristocracy versus humility, Nietzsche's very problem with Renan is that these are not actual tensions within him. Humility wins, and his conception of the aristocracy is colored by his view of humility as, inherently being a virtue, which comes from Christianity. So Renan wishes to associate science with nobility, but science, with its appeals to universal reason, to the ability of any mind to follow the scientific method, and any mind who is reasonable to attain an understanding of empirical reality, well, in that sense, science is democratic. So Renan poses as a free spirit, as a modern, as a man capable of critique or even of mockery, but in his belly, he's just a Christian. That's how he feels, right? He's just another priest of the Christian religion. Notice that Nietzsche's criticism of Renan is that he doesn't come down on the side of yes or no, but, quote, misses the point with painful regularity, end quote. Renan doesn't make real warfare, and so accordingly he doesn't settle any issues. He simply unbends the bowstring. So once again, Nietzsche's method here is to make the so-called psychologist himself into a case study and reveal that Renan's own psychology or his own approach to it has never descended into the depths. He didn't uncover anything about Jesus. He merely told us things about Renan. And so what was it that spoke out of Renan? Who is speaking? Why did his voice resonate? Because his secularization of Christianity was simply a demand for Christianity to survive secularization. His strange theories about Jesus and about the Jews were a demand for the Christian identity to harmonize with the zeitgeist at the time. The ideals, the idols that Renan worshipped were popular idols. There was no nobility in what he offered. It was just a reification of the popular prejudices. But again, something very informative about Nietzsche's attitude, when we look to his remarks in Beyond Good and Evil, about how wonderful it is to have one's antipodes. How when he first read the sentences of Renan's that he quotes, he hated them, but Nietzsche tells us over time he grew to love them. And that's Nietzsche's great virtue as a psychologist, and it's what I'm sort of trying to get at when I invoke the quote-unquote impersonal, or the objective, or the dispassionate, these aspects of Nietzsche's approach. It's why all those terms are sort of misnomers, because Nietzsche's state of mind can't rightly be called objective. It's something subtler than that. It's a kind of delight in encountering contrast, in encountering that which refutes him, encountering tension with his ideas. And part of that that we find in Nietzsche's approach is that there's a real desire to articulate what the actual point of tension is, to fully articulate and understand the contrasting values driving two mutually incomprehensible viewpoints. And so at a first taste, you find that such a contrasting viewpoint that's totally antithetical to your own. It's sort of revolting. But it's the acquired taste, we might say, the more sophisticated palate that the natural psychologist develops. So the impersonality, the objectivity that operates in Nietzsche's thought, the reason why it's possible is because he has a personal taste for antipodal viewpoints. He has no desire to falsify the opposition to him into something that it isn't. He actually takes a delight in finding the clearest possible statement of the opposition to his ideas. the clearest sounding out of their tone. In section 28 of Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, entitled The Impersonal Get a Word In, or another translation would be The Objective Ones Speak, Nietzsche gives us a paragraph written entirely within scare quotes, the words of the so-called impersonal or objective type. And it certainly seems as though he's attacking this type, taking jabs at them. But there's a sense in which he's likely being self-critical here, given everything we've talked about. This is, from a certain perspective, an attack on Nietzsche's own type, as the impersonal psychologist who understands that his own interest is nevertheless deeply personal. So Nietzsche writes in this section, speaking for the impersonal ones, quote, "Nothing comes more easily to us than to be wise, patient, superior. We are soaked in the oil of indulgence and of sympathy. We are absurdly just. We forgive everything. Precisely on that account, we should be severe with ourselves. For that very reason, we ought, from time to time, to go in for a little emotion, a little emotional vice. It may seem bitter to us, and between ourselves we may even laugh at the figure which it makes us cut. But what does it matter? We have no other kind of self-control left. This is our asceticism, our manner of performing penance." End quote. And Nietzsche then concludes the passage with a sentence with no scare quotes. Quote, "To become personal, the virtues of the impersonal and objective one." End quote. So the impartial adjudicator, the impersonal psychologist, that's the type who can be absurdly just, who can just forgive everything because he understands everything. That's the formula, as Nietzsche puts it, in Antichrist. But in that same book, he also sort of laments this idea. He calls it a kind of symptom of our modern cosmopolitan age. That we forgive everything because we understand everything is the kind of thing that's the kind of mentality you could only have in the modern cosmopolitan world. And he says here in Twilight of Idols, the formula for his happiness is a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. And this is why such an impersonal thinker must be severe with themselves. Allow themselves the emotional vice of irrationally committing to their values. This is their penance, so to speak, for their idle psychological leisure time. Their vice of attempting to understand everything and thus to explain it within a world of drives and impulses. Everything forgiven, all unconscious, all unchosen, all predestined according to who and what one is. The penance for that worldview is to occasionally become personal, become biased, lose your objectivity. So oftentimes we would think being objective, dispassionate is a sort of moral duty, and Nietzsche here has described that as a vice for which we must pay penance. And that penance for that vice is occasionally indulging in the passions or irrational drives and impulses, irrational valuations, which is normally regarded as something that we would pay penance for, not pay penance by indulging in them. So, it's very interesting to contrast this with Nietzsche's project in the Antichrist, that that entire book could be seen as his penance for the vice, the idleness of psychology that characterizes this work and certainly Beyond Good and Evil and many before it. In the Antichrist, he sets out to make up for the fact that much of his commentary on Christianity remains at arm's length, so to speak, and that it's in that work where he definitively says, I am against this. I am engaged in a struggle against Christianity. This, for Nietzsche, is a matter of taste more than anything. It's motivated quite openly by his instinct. And so, for a modern intellectual critical type, it requires a bit of self-control, a kind of asceticism, to act wholly in accord with their own instincts. So this in itself is an indication of the sickness of modernity that Nietzsche rejects in that work, because it means to have to obey one's intellect, to tyrannize over oneself. And that's already an indication that one's impulses are in a sort of disarray. But it's interesting to notice. So that's the way I would understand this whole dynamic, but it's just interesting to notice it in the way that Nietzsche inverts our common morality, where self-control here is defined as giving into an instinct. Because, we might say, our modern instincts have been turned topsy-turvy so that our first instinct is to always restrain our instincts. This is, again, very helpfully described by Deleuze of becoming a reactive type of people, is what the modern person is. Becoming a reactive type of people. We're constantly in reaction to our instincts and impulses and drives. Perhaps in contrast to those bad examples of psychologists, people like Schopenhauer or Renan, who are actually cases, Nietzsche does offer a positive example of another psychologist. This is in the same chapter that Nietzsche gives us a counterexample to the gone courts, and he finds his exemplar in Dostoevsky, and for a fascinating reason. He writes in section 45, quote, "The criminal type is the type of the strong man amid unfavorable conditions, a strong man made sick. He lacks the wild and savage state, a form of nature and existence which is freer and more dangerous, in which everything that constitutes the shield and the sword and the instinct of the strong man takes a place by right. Society puts a ban on his virtues. The most spirited instincts inherent in him become immediately involved with the depressing passions, with suspicion, fear, and dishonor. But this is almost the recipe for physiological degeneration. When a man has to do that which he is best suited to do, which he is most fond of doing, not only clandestinely, but also with long suspense, caution, and ruse, he becomes anemic. And inasmuch as he is always having to pay for his instincts in the form of danger, persecution, and fatalities, even his feelings begin to turn against these instincts. He begins to regard them as fatal. It is society, our tame, mediocre, castrated society, in which an untutored son of nature who comes to us from his mountains or from his adventures at sea must necessarily degenerate into a criminal, or almost necessarily. For there are cases in which such a man shows himself to be stronger than society. The Corsican Napoleon is the most celebrated case of this. Concerning the problem before us, Dostoevsky's testimony is of importance. Dostoevsky, who incidentally was the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn. He belongs to the happiest windfalls of my life, happier even than the discovery of Stendhal. This profound man, who was right 10 times over in esteeming the superficial Germans low, found the Siberian convicts among whom he lived for many years, those thoroughly hopeless criminals for whom no road back to society stood open, very different from what even he had expected. That is to say, carved from about the best, hardest, and most valuable material that grows on Russian soil." End quote. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Dostoevsky is a Russian writer, and he was arrested during the reign of the Tsar in the mid-1800s. He was part of a circle of writers, some of whom had liberal sentiments. Although, in the political climate of the day, the group overall is rather tame in their political sentiment. Overwhelmingly reformist rather than revolutionary. Still, they had read and written about books that were forbidden by the regime, and Dostoevsky, along with 4 others, was sentenced to death for subversive anti-government activity. His sentence was commuted at the last minute, and he spent several years in a Siberian prison camp. He had a horrific time at this gulag, as he was kept shackled most of the time. The winters were unbearably cold. Conditions were cramped, stuffy, rife with disease. He was allowed only the New Testament to read and was afflicted with hemorrhoids and seizures. Nietzsche read a few of Dostoevsky's works, although probably not Crime and Punishment. He for certain read The Idiot, The Possessed, Notes from the Underground, Humiliated and Insulted, House of the Dead, perhaps a few others. In The Idiot, there's a scene that recounts such an execution as the one that they marched Dostoevsky out into but didn't actually carry out. There's also, I should note, some question about the quality of translation that Nietzsche had available to him with Dostoevsky, but we won't get into that here. Suffice to say, he had at least a partial exposure to Dostoevsky's ideas and to his literary style. So what did Nietzsche like about Dostoevsky? What is the basis of his admiration as he writes about it here? Well, Dostoevsky is a great psychologist. If fiction is based on that psychological foundation, in some sense, that's the underlying truth of literary fiction. The meaning of literary fiction that figures like Joseph Campbell and in our own time, people like Jordan Peterson like to point to, that's the psychological meaning that undergirds it, and Dostoevsky is one of the best writers of all time, and so he is a true psychologist. Why? Well, Dostoevsky understands human beings and human motivations because of his life experience. And what is that life experience? Well, being marched to the threshold of death, deposited in the middle of the Siberian cold, the hardened criminal element of society. He meets real characters, real human beings who, one can be assured, if nothing else, they're not mass produced from specifications, the kind of modern people, who slot easily into the system. They're the kind of men to whom no road to society is open to them, no road back into polite society. And so in other times and places, the types that in modern times are considered criminals would have been the best, most independent, self-sufficient souls around. Simply not in our modern industrial, post-industrial time. And so what Nietzsche's understanding of what happens to Dostoevsky is that he perceives that these Siberian hardened criminals are, in so many words, individuals. They are men whose essential difference from the rest of society we can be assured of, and they exist in a real state of antagonism with the rest of society. These are not the types who have gone along with what was expected of them. And so Nietzsche's explanation for Dostoevsky's amazing capacities as a psychologist is that he's placed among human beings who were out of place in the emasculated modernity, but in other times would have been the most successful members of the human race. And so in some strange way, the most laudable, the most interesting people of Dostoevsky's time and place, that's who he's placed among. But he didn't come by this knowledge by picking up a pencil and notepad and going to interview men in the local prison. He didn't go and artificially collect knowledge based on observing all the traits of such hardened criminals as part of a study. That experience was what was given to him. That was what befell him in his life. And it just so happened that he had the eyes to see into the character of such men. And with this insight, he becomes one of the best literary psychologists of all time. As Nietzsche says earlier in Twilight of Idols, he mistrusts all systematizers. For, quote, the will to a system is the lack of integrity, end quote. And accordingly, the points of his method that we've considered can't really be made into a kind of systematic approach. We could nevertheless pick up a couple of pieces of worthwhile advice, though, a set of healthy guidelines. We might call them tips, Nietzsche's tips for success as psychological thinkers. That one should not have to strain or squint to find the psychological underpinnings of an idea or an action. Rather, its actor will reveal its meaning in very certain terms for anyone who has eyes to see or ears to hear. One should keep their eyes peeled and their ears open for such insights, but let them come to you in the natural course of life. A serious enough study of even the most mundane characters can reveal everything about human psychology, more so than if you spent a lifetime gathering character traits as if they were data points. A psychologist should learn the book of the world and use this understanding to approach himself, and know that any study of himself will usually be too close for him to see clearly. And he should above all know that his impartiality and his disinterestedness and his pretensions to being objective, that all of this is above all an interest in a particular kind of pleasure. Whether it's the pleasure of setting himself above the animal or above the human, or whether it's the pleasure of encountering conflicting articulations of value, the taste that Nietzsche has for his antipodes, or the usefulness that one gleans in discovering them. And above all, the psychologist should discern which among all the writers and thinkers and poets are his fellow travelers as psychologists, and which are actually cases for study, imposters among the ranks of the psychologists. This is, in summary, Nietzsche's advice, and it's in this spirit that he goes about tapping upon ideals as though striking a hollow idol with a tuning fork. His attitude, above all, has to be an immoralist attitude, a refusal to let moral viewpoints color his view of reality. And as he operates without such moral revulsion, he can even delight in viewpoints which are antithetical to his or outright erroneous, and see the value in our errors. As Nietzsche wrote in a fragment criticizing Schopenhauer way back in 1867, when he was a young man, he wrote, quote, "The errors of great men are venerable because they are more fruitful than the truths of little men." End quote. Hopefully, this episode has been a leisurely little bit of sunshine, a leap sideways into the idle hours of a psychologist, perhaps a welcome escape from the interested, petty, personal world. And so, in light of the psychoanalysts that we discussed earlier this season, I just thought it would be appropriate to talk about Nietzsche as a psychologist, and I thought this was perhaps the best work to use as a concrete basis for that. We're very soon coming to the end of the season. We only have a few episodes left. Some of these next ones are the kind of episodes I've been waiting for the whole podcast's existence to make. So stay tuned. We're going to end on some good ones. That's all for this week, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.